Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to moderate this discussion on the cities of the future and the future of cities in this city of Manila, which is the 18th largest city in the world. For the first time in human history, most human beings now live in cities. 30% in the year 1950, over 54% today, an estimated 66% by the year 2050. So a discussion on the cities of the future is not just a discussion on cities. It is a discussion on how we are going to live and work in the future. We have a wonderful panel to begin the discussion this afternoon. We have Robert Doyle, the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, ranked recently for the 5th time, 5 years in a row, as the most livable city in the world. We have Dr. Frank Appel, the CEO of Deutsche Post DHL, the world's leading logistics and mail services corporation. And a major user of cities. We have Perrin Beattie, the President and CEO of the Canada Chamber of Commerce. Canada is home to a number of the world's most livable cities. And last but not least, we have Jaime Zobel de Ayala, Chairman of the Ayala Corporation, recipient of the Harvard Business School Alumni Achievement Award, recipient of the Presidential Medal for Merit. Thank you. Gentlemen, let's talk about the challenges facing cities. When we look at our world, which is increasingly a world of cities, we see a small number of cities, highly livable, doing very well. And we see a large number of cities struggling with almost chronic problems: inadequate infrastructure, traffic congestion to the point of paralysis. Mayor Doyle, Lord Mayor Doyle, coming from Melbourne, a successful city, when you travel the world, when you see the challenges confronting cities throughout the world, what, in your view, is the biggest challenge facing the cities of today and of the future?
Let me tell you a little bit about mine and our challenges. We're a city of about 4.3 million people. It's a large city by Australian standards, down in the southeast corner of Australia. But we're growing very quickly for an Australian city. The Australian Bureau of Statistics says sometime around 2050, we're a city of perhaps 8 million. We overtake Sydney in the 2030s. And that means that speed of growth means for me that many of my problems are those that are similar to cities throughout the world. How do I make decisions now that will ensure the prosperity of the city, the sustainability of the city, the resilience of the city, and the livability of the city? So I've just got 2 very quick little stories about a model now that I don't think will work in the future, although it did for us, and a very, very quick example of what the model for the future might be, I think, for all of us. First one is this. When I was first elected mayor in 2008, we were at the end of a drought. February of the next year, we had a terrible bushfire, a wildfire in our state. It killed 173 people. It destroyed over 2,000 houses. It was an awful event. But what led up to that event was 10 days in our city that was over 40 degrees Celsius. That, in the old scale, if you use the Fahrenheit scale, is 104. And that final day was 47 degrees, 116 in the old scale. In that week, nearly 500 people died in my city as a result of heat. Elderly people, vulnerable people, people with respiratory problems and compromise. And when we got through that awful period, we thought to ourselves, what can we do? What can we do to protect people from this in the future? And you know, the answer wasn't that difficult. What we did, first of all, we did a thermal map of the whole city. So right from the outskirts of the city into the centre. And what we found was the centre of the city, unsurprisingly, was 5 degrees hotter than the outskirts of the city, the so-called heat island effect. Then we digitally mapped all of the trees in the central city only, just the sort of 38 square kilometres of the central city. And we decided the one thing that we could do to future-proof us against that sort of terrible death toll was pretty simple: plant trees. So we started planting 3,000 extra trees a year, and we'll do so for 10 years. And we know that that will cool the centre of the city by 5 degrees. And think about the effect of that on those very high temperature days. And the reason that we think this is a great public policy, and we're working with Auckland right now, we're working with Los Angeles, with San Francisco to share what we did, is that it is transferable, it's scalable, it's affordable, and it's measurable. And we did that. We also had to do, I think Bunker was talking about this earlier, stormwater harvesting. And we did all of that to try to future-proof our city against those extreme heat events that we know we're going to get. And we did that with a little bit of federal money, but not much, to be honest. And we were able to do it. But to be honest, I don't think that's a sustainable way of us thinking about how do we want to be the most livable city in the world in 2050. We can't do it ourselves. So the second quick example is maybe the way forward, and it's much harder. We're about to build the biggest piece of city infrastructure in Australia. It's a rail tunnel. There are two 9-kilometre underground rail tunnels that we have to dig. And that's so that we can move people about. If you can't move people in your city, it is not livable. And by the way, cars, that's not what cities are for. Cities are for people. And you've got to be thinking about people first, not about the motor car. So moving large numbers of people should not be by motor car. But in order to do that, it is going to need to be a partnership between the federal government, the state government, the city government, and the private sector. We're still squabbling a bit about who will pay for what, but in the end, it's got to be a partnership between all of us to deliver this major project for the livability of our city in the future. When I go back to that terrible week that was leading up to Black Saturday, the city very nearly failed. As we got to that Friday night, telecommunications failed. The rail line started to buckle, so we weren't sure if we could get over 1 million people from the centre of the city home. Lifts all over the city began to fail. The city began to shut down. And so we knew if we were to future-proof our city, we'd have to do things like plant those trees to cool the city down, but work out ways that are much more efficient about moving people in and around our city. So that model of the future is going to be about how well we line up together and cooperate to deliver these very big projects. Otherwise, our cities won't have futures.
Plant trees, infrastructure to move people. The key is partnership. This, of course, brings us to the question of how to get the politics in line with the solutions. But we'll return to that later. I suspect that's a very long discussion. Frank, you are the CEO of the world's leading logistics mail services company. And almost by definition, you have become an authority on how cities work, whether they work well, whether they don't work well, it affects how you do business. What is the biggest challenge confronting cities today and the city of the future?
Yeah, so if I reflect what I hear when traveling around the world, the biggest theme for all cities is congestion. People spend massive of time in traffic instead of being home with their families or being on time to work, and that's a massive problem. And the problem with that is you can't overcome that very simply because you need long-term planning to upgrade the infrastructure. So when I'm talking to mayors of cities, you know, they are definitely not stupid and know the problem. The challenge is somehow to plan long-term on one end. That is not easy, as I said. Therefore, we usually say, try to think more from how you use the capacity you have already in the smartest way. And that there are many different ways to do that. One is that instead of having traffic into the city for deliveries for products to retail or whatsoever, do it at night when the capacity is not used. Or using marine technology to use your main roads by Internet of Things to maximize the flow through these roads. So, the idea of using the existing infrastructure in the smartest ways is probably a shorter and better answer than thinking only to upgrade the capacity for major infrastructure investments, because there are always, conflicts with the people who live there. There's, then there's missing money to do that and all this kind of stuff. So I believe a very important thing, and we see that as well in many places, is that you debottleneck your system somehow by maximize the capacity you have already in place.
So a big challenge is congestion, traffic congestion, and we should be thinking in terms of the smart use of existing infrastructure.
Yes.
Great. Perrin, do you agree with that assessment? It seems that when one starts getting into the problems confronting cities, that we almost need a qualitative leap, that incremental solutions are not going to work. I'm just wondering whether a part or a large part of the answer lies in technology.
I have no doubt that that's the case. Certainly a starting point for us is how do we use technologies far more intelligently than we're doing today? When you look at the Internet of Things and the potential there is there for us to do things dramatically differently from how we've done them in the past, there's enormous potential for us to be far more efficient in terms of how we use the resources within cities to allow our citizens to connect much better, to enable them to be more respectful of the environment, to create living conditions that are provide a better quality of life for our citizens. And using these technologies, I think we can make substantial differences. Infrastructure is key, and certainly from a Canadian perspective, we need to make major infrastructure investments in our urban areas, and also in trade promoting infrastructure. That is absolutely key, whether it's digital infrastructure, roads, railways, public transportation systems, a whole range of other areas. The other area that I would stress, though, too, is let's not focus entirely on things. We also have to focus on people. Toronto is a city roughly the size of Melbourne. One of the things that makes it unique is its diversity. And we have every country's first-generation diaspora in the greater Toronto area, speaking their language, coming from having family and friends back home, maintaining ties with the rest of the world, and it works. What is critical at the end of the day is how does your population manage, and is there a quality of life where people feel at home in the city, where they feel welcome, and where it's a place that will attract the best and the brightest. As we look at the challenges facing Canadian cities, it's what can we do to attract capital? What can we do to attract the people that we need to move the city on to the next level? And having in place both the physical infrastructure and in the social infrastructure as well is absolutely critical for us to be able to do that.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to this challenge of how one is able to attract investment into those priority areas. Jaime, you are the only member of this panel who operates in an emerging country context. When one visits Manila, one is struck by a certain contrast. The contrast between privately provided infrastructure and the high quality of it. Much of it the result of the good work done by your company, the Ayala Corporation, and the inadequacy of publicly provided infrastructure. This contrast, of course, is played out in many different major cities in the emerging world. What is the big challenge there? High quality private infrastructure, inadequate public infrastructure. What is the problem?
I think, Timothy, you touch on an important topic, which is, I guess, private sector capacity and public sector capacity. Let me just start with the positives. This trend towards urbanization in our country, and the city of Manila in particular, has led to tremendous growth in the nation. And so, while density in and of itself can seem like a negative, let me just start by saying that in the case of the Philippines, it's a positive. If you look at our economic numbers, out of Greater Metro Manila, basically comes the bulk of our GNP in the country. That's number one. Number two, in the Philippines, as you can see in traveling around, we're not that organized from an infrastructure point of view, but there's massive creativity that takes place in the city. As a nation, we're not as structured, for example, as the Germans in planning ahead, organizing ourselves, but the amount of creativity in this city is phenomenal. We produce musicians, artists, draftsmen, designers, and they travel all over the world. And so somehow they thrive within the sort of controlled chaos that is Manila, and get produced by it and move out and succeed in other places. So there's a combustion that happens in the city that's there. Now, you bring up the whole topic of public versus private. I've always believed that the private sector has a greater role in emerging markets like ours to contribute to some of the developmental needs that the public sector needs to hurdle. There are many topics one can go on, but I'd like to take a lead from the Lord Mayor's point of view and maybe just focus on one area, which is the whole area of preparing for disasters. I've mentioned that Greater Metro Manila is an economic hub for the country. That is a positive. The negative is if it ever got hit by a major disaster, it would have a crippling effect on the country. So one has to think ahead and say, how can one minimize that? And now I go to the public-private sector component. The private sector, I think, has in countries like ours, has inordinate access to great people, to capital, to resources, and is able to do a lot more in countries like ours. So I think with it comes a greater responsibility to contribute in some way to addressing some of the many problems we have. And just focusing on the disaster side, I was very impressed with the mayor's planning in Melbourne. In our case, we're part of an earthquake belt, the Ring of Fire. We're also part of the typhoon movement. What some of us have done is every time disaster hit, the private sector would get called upon to help out the government, which I think is correct. But after a while, we said to ourselves, we called each other up, convened ourselves, and said, why doesn't the private sector get together and organize ourselves so that in moments of future disaster, we're completely prepared? So through a foundation, a large grouping of us representing public utilities, infrastructure, real estate developers, logistics companies, we all banded together under a foundation called PDRF. We've gotten broad representation of the governance, and we've put up one emergency center with the plan of putting two up long-term, being run 24/7 by private individuals, and the whole data bank of all the resources we can bring to play in a moment's notice in case of disaster. So we become a single point of contact for the government in times of disaster. Now, going back to public-private linkages, we felt that that was a major contribution we could make as the private sector to helping prepare ahead. Our ability to organize the resources we have are sometimes greater than the government's. The government has to worry about 100 million people. We have assets that are within our control, and we thought that was one way of coming together as a private sector, uniting ourselves, having one point of contact, being organized, being ready at a moment's notice to provide resources to the government at a point of need. And the biggest driver of that is the fear that we have, many of the economic players, that in a time of great disaster, which could happen at any time, as we know, black swans hit us on a regular basis, we be able to respond immediately. I think the Lord Mayor said, people say, how come telecommunications equipment is not up in times of crisis? When power shuts down, and invariably it does, there are few things you can really do. You can prepare, but when a major storm or a major typhoon hits you, things will go down. And after the power cuts down, the battery supply to the telecommunication towers start to come down after 24 hours, and it's just a domino effect. But however, preparing ahead for it, having resources in key components of the country, and being able to work as a grouping of private sector companies is just a great way of preparing and helping the government in times of need. That's just one thought I wanted to contribute to the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Timothy, could I just want to say a very
Yes,
quick
Lord
word
Mayor.
in furious agreement with Frank and with Perrin. Frank made the point about infrastructure. If our city doubles in size, there's absolutely no way that we can exactly duplicate our infrastructure. You just got to work out much smarter ways of using what you've got now, as well as building the new stuff that you're going to need. So smart cities will do that. And to take Perrin's point, I think that human capital, that diversity, is one of the greatest strengths you can have. We say very proudly in Melbourne we come from 200 different nationalities. We speak more than 240 different languages and dialects. We practice 105 different faiths, but we're one Melbourne. And it's one of the great strengths of a city to have that diversity of human capital as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, just taking from a point that Jaime made, it's quite clear listening to Jaime and looking at Manila that a large part of the answer comes in terms of private sector, enterprise, innovation, creativity. But it is also clear if you look at the world of cities that business cannot do everything. Part of the infrastructure challenge must be met by governments. So however difficult it is, we need to address the question of what is the proper role of government and what is the partnership that we talk about as necessary between government and business. So, Perrin, I mean, you used to be a minister in the Canadian government, and now you are president of the Canada Chamber of Commerce. What do you think is the key in terms of getting this partnership right? Too much government is a problem.
Yeah.
Too little government is a problem. What is the answer?
Well, there's no one size that fits all on this. As a matter, we all are feeling our way along with it. But you look at infrastructure alone. In Canada, we have a significant infrastructure deficit. We need to first of all, do triage and focus on the areas where we can have trade promoting and other important infrastructure which will have the most economic impact in terms of creating economic growth and improving quality of life. But governments alone, even if you look at that area, do not have enough money to do it. We need to look at creative ways of financing infrastructure like public-private partnerships. And this is one of the areas where Australia's been pioneering, Canada's been pioneering, and there's much more that we could be doing to move that ahead. Increasingly with the issues that we're facing today, they're issues that are shared, that aren't owned by government or owned by the private sector or owned by the federal government or by the states or by the municipality. They're shared issues that require a collaborative approach. And attempting to put people into cubby holes or put the issues into cubby holes just isn't going to work. We're going to need to find ways of bringing business, labor, the academic sector, governments at all level to the table to say, let's focus on the problem rather than on jurisdiction, and how do we work together to fix it. The private sector can bring capital, and it can bring expertise. And those are two key areas where we can supplement what government can do. But government can bring vision, and it can bring its convening power to get people to the table to try to resolve issues.
Thank you very much. Frank, do you know how many cities DHL operates in?
I know in how many countries and territories, 220, so it's probably thousands,
So
whatever you call a city.
You must have strong opinions on cities that work and on cities that don't. Now, we're not going to put you on the spot by asking you to name the cities that don't work. But, you know, when you look at the world in which DHL operates in, and that is the known world, what do you see as the biggest thing that government-business partnership should focus on?
Yeah, maybe first of all, unfortunately, I haven't seen too many cities of large scale who have done well, including my own home country. You know, we have a lot of congestion in the meantime as well, despite that we are famous for having good infrastructure. So I think the world is really challenged because the private and the company traffic has increased significantly with all the consequences it has. And therefore, I think the challenge is somehow that there are interesting concepts. Like we have talked to several cities about creating warehouses around the cities and combining then deliveries for many customers and many companies in one way instead of having you know, everybody is doing his same. Is it doing it himself for different customers and so on and so forth? We didn't succeed yet because finally, always the question comes, but how do we keep competition up? You know, how do we get then logistics companies still competing if you are providing all the services to the city? Despite that would be significant improvement. And that's the problem, and I think we need to find new ways how governments, competitors are working together to use the infrastructure which is available. And we have not found good answers, and that's an obligation for mayors, but it's also for our industry and our customers, you know, how we link our, you know, activities better together and say, okay, in one city, company A is doing that, like an airport is operated by company A in one city, and another one is company B, and that could create a significant opportunity somewhere. So that is an example. Not to speak about infrastructure. The infrastructure challenge is because it's usually beyond the tenure of CEOs and mayors. And that creates a specific problem. You know, if you are not elected 3 or 4 times, you don't see the benefits of all the investments you have originally launched. And that makes it even more difficult because somebody has to fund it and somebody has to push it, and you get all the negatives of these kind of things instead of getting the benefits from that later on. And that's true for company leaders, but also true for politicians. So there is no easy answer except that we should be more self-critical and saying, you know, we have to think significantly beyond our tenure, and we should measure ourselves more what happens after we step down from our jobs instead of being proud of what we have achieved in our tenure.
I want to pose a question to the Lord Mayor, and then after that, I'd like to open up the discussion to questions from the floor. Lord Mayor, you know, it's clear when we get into this discussion that there is a need for long-range thinking, because no way we are going to create the cities of the future with short-term 3-5-year cycles. And yet, our modern politics is all about short-term thinking. Now, you are Lord Mayor of the world's most livable city.
For 5 years in a row.
5 years in a row. For 5 years in a row.
Did we mention that?
And yet, increasingly, the kind of politics, not just in your country, but in the developed world, is short-term with a revolving chair at the top. How does one reconcile the need for long-range thinking, the courage to make those long-term decisions, and all these short-term political considerations? After the Lord Mayor, open the discussion to the floor, so if you have questions, prepare for them.
It's a central conundrum, and it's a real problem in adversarial politics that, you know, one government gets in and has a set of priorities and everyone's heading down that track, and then suddenly, in a very short electoral cycle, a government of a different flavour gets in, and suddenly all of that's passé, we're going this way now, and the public are sick of it. In Australia, there is a discussion, particularly around infrastructure, that these decisions should be made in a way that all sides sign up to, and then there is a way forward. I don't really see much hope of that, to be perfectly honest, because each side has their own particular platform, and so I don't hold out a lot of hope. You can do some small things that are actually, you know, not reliant upon the politicians. When we did our 10-year financial plan for the city, we didn't do it as a Lord Mayor, Deputy Lord Mayor and group of councillors with our advisors. We brought in a process of participatory democracy where we got a representative group of our citizenry, a representative group, and we made available to all of them all of the information that's available to us from our experts, from our financial controllers, with all the infrastructure issues that we needed. And we said to that people's panel, you come up with a 10-year financial plan for the city of Melbourne. Now, we left to ourselves the final decision to adopt it, but in the end we did. We adopted it wholesale. And the reason that I have confidence that that will survive is because it didn't come from Robert Doyle or my predecessor or my successor, who I hope is in about 25 years' time, but that's a different issue too. It actually came directly from the people whom it will affect. And therefore, I think it has a validity and a substance that is beyond political substance. Now, that's sad in one way, that you have to bypass the political system in order to get it. But as I say, there are small experiments like that going on in places like Canada as well as in Australia. But until, for instance, on infrastructure, we can have people leave their guns at the door and come together and think of either the country or the state or the city first and not their mantra, which is win the next election, then we won't get such general agreement. And I don't hold out much hope for us, I regret to say.
I'm going to ask the next question of Jaime, but we'll do that after opening to the floor. But I'm going to ask you to address that very same question, except in your context, it's an emerging country context. How does one reconcile the need for long-range thinking with democratic politics, so to speak? But yes, questions from the floor on this subject of the cities of the future and the future of cities. Questions from the floor?
While they're thinking, can I add a point, just whether I
Please.
wanted to be political or disputatious with the Lord Mayor, who has gotten the plug for Melbourne as the most livable city. 3 of the 5 top cities in the list were Canadian.
They were. That's because Canadian cities are very like Australian cities. Look, the reality is on that scale, there isn't really much difference at all between the top 10 or 15 cities. It's a polite fiction that there is.
Gentlemen, we will convene a separate session for this. Jaime, you know, because so far we have been discussing this private-public linkage challenge in a developed world context. Provide us with another perspective.
Let me just start by saying that having visited Melbourne, Vancouver, Toronto, and Quebec, you all have wonderful cities. You got nothing to worry about between yourselves.
He's the politician among us.
Diplomat.
But I think actually now I understand why Melbourne has done so well. I want to take an idea that the Lord Mayor put together, and I think it's just magnificent, which is the whole concept of taking an independent group to do a study, which the political leadership can either accept, add, or modify as they see fit, but get the communities involved in the planning, gives an overarching long-term direction to the needs of the community, and then it's up to the political forces to take it or not. I think that is just a phenomenal idea. I think it has happened in other cities, but not that often, and I think it's wonderful. I think the private sector can bring a lot of progressive thinking, some quick decision-making and capital to ideas. At the same time, you do need the policymakers, the government, to create a framework that is equal to all. The private sector is not generally very good at being altruistic, and that's the role of governments. But if you can blend the two together, that overarch, I guess, political periods of leadership, then you start to create something fundamentally, very strong. Actually, I think that's an excellent idea, but it would, of course, take for the local governments to convene, empower, and put together a study like that, and then use it in a serious way. Let me just add that we have a little level of complexity in the city, greater city of Manila. All of you think of Manila as one city, but we're actually fundamentally made up of I think 7 or 8 different cities, each with their own mayors. In our particular case, it's a different problem. There is no overarching framework to unite the infrastructure of these different cities. And that's a challenge that we have, given the governance structure of Greater Metro Manila. And perhaps taking a page from the mayor's advice, the whole thought of creating an independent group to recommend to all the mayors a fundamental piece of working infrastructure that unites all the cities, and then subject, of course, to the approval of the political entities and the local governments, is just a great way to move forward.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, the lady.
I've attended.
Identify yourself first, then ask the
I'm
question.
Cora de la Paz Bernardo, former head of the Philippine Social Security System, ex-PWC, and I was president of the International Social Security Association.
Thank you.
I've attended a conference in San Gallen about cities of the future, preparing for the aging population. How do you think we should prepare for a population of old people? Because the requirements will be different from what the ordinary citizens require. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent question. I will take another 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll turn to the panel. Are there other questions? Yes, another lady.
Hi, Christina Ampil from PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was wondering, what technology are you most excited about to apply in cities? And how do you make sure the technology that's applied doesn't get obsolete now that technology advances are so quick? Thank you.
Thank you. Second question on technology and how to apply. Another question? If not, we'll turn to the panel. Yes? Another lady.
Hi, my name is Karina Hunt. I'm a Canadian delegate from the Voices of the Future program. And I understand that cities are expected to be future economic drivers. However, how are we planning to reconcile the development of cities with, while not neglecting rural areas? Because food security, for example, in the Northern Territories of Canada, and also mental health in these areas is a huge concern right now. Thank you.
Okay, question on the right balance between planning for cities and not forgetting rural areas. So let me turn now to the panel. The first question on how do cities take care of their aging populations. I thought I would direct this to Lord Mayor Robert Doyle and Jaime Zobel. And then the second question is on technology for cities. I thought I would direct this to Perrin Beatty and Frank Apple. And the balance between the urban and the rural, I asked for a volunteer to respond to that question. So preparing for the aging. Robert.
First of all, there's something that you can do in your city which is around design. We talk about 8 to 80. So if you're 8 years old or you're 80 years old, you should be able to navigate perfectly comfortably and safely the city itself. And there are things you can do in urban design to make sure that happens. So the first thing is think about the way that your city works. Secondly, we have a very developed aged care sector in Australia that partly supports aging in place for obviously as long as possible in terms of independent living, but then has a residential aged care system and a palliative care end-of-life system that is both private and public. So while we're not perfect at it by any means, it's quite a developed system. Recently we've had a discussion about how long should you work, when's your retirement age, and that's getting pushed further and further out. And so I've heard a couple of times that, you know, the sort of what we would call grey power, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, is a power to be harnessed both for the economy and particularly socially. So we've got to work out smarter ways of doing it. For me, it begins with urban design.
Thank you very much. Jaime?
I think Cora's question is a fascinating one because I think we assume aging taking place within the framework of aging today. But everywhere, everything I read, everything I look at is that we're going to be adding 10, 20 years to our lives very, very soon. And that reality of a completely different population base with a whole different physical and mental state is going to be a reality for all of us. In the Philippines, and I think a lot of it depends on the society, we have a very strong extended family orientation in the Philippines. And there are a lot of social safety nets. We don't need as many physical ones precisely because there's so many extended social safety nets that I think cushion us a little bit from the dangers of this. That having been said, I think the Lord Mayor made reference to some of the public responsibilities. We, in the private sector, those who build infrastructure, apartments, places for rent, we have to start taking into account the very needs, I guess, of a different level of population. Right now, we're a little bit dulled in our thinking because the vast majority of the Philippines is extremely young. And so we actually tend to focus a lot on youth when we think of our physical spaces. But I think you're absolutely right. Cora's got a point that with this extension of life, we have to start changing the focus and create zones, physical spaces, amenities, support systems that begin to address that. And I think the private sector has a role in beginning to think that through. Perhaps we haven't thought about it enough.
Thank you very much. Now, the second question on technology, how to think about it, how to adapt it, how to use it cleverly. Frank, you first.
Yeah, I understood the question somehow, and what is the most exciting one? There's a very straightforward, simple one, which is already in use by us. It's electric vehicles. So we have our own small startup, which we bought recently, a spin-off of a university who has built our electric vans for last mile delivery, which is quite exciting because it takes a lot of pollution out of the city. So that's working. It's also linked to consumers, and customers can buy a carbon neutral product, and we then invest the money we get into additional electric cars. We are experimenting with drones. Drones could be easily used at night, using the air instead of having traffic to deliver that. The most fascinating is probably avatars. We had done a study of future scenarios, what might happen, and it's not too unlikely that maybe in 20 years we all have our avatar who's doing the grocery shopping for us instead of that we are going there. That's definitely something which would change the situation in cities quite massively. So these are technologies we are looking at, we are using, and we are quite excited about. So that's one. On rural areas, I think the situation, despite that more people leave rural areas, has probably never better, because you can get through the internet education. You can probably get better health advice through the internet. And of course, you can get e-commerce deliveries into the rural areas. You are not depending on big malls. You can have the same access to products you want to buy through a completely different approach than in the past. So I think, despite that more and more people are moving in the bigger cities, there is a huge opportunity as well for people who live in the rural areas, and the situation probably is better than ever before, particularly in the emerging countries, where are no proper education available, no proper health systems available, and no purchase of interesting products is possible. So, and all these are addressable at the moment better than they have been before, and that might change as well the situation that people don't want to move any longer in major city, but want to live where they are living.
Thank you very much. So technology is a very large part of the future, of the cities of the future. Yeah. Perrin, do you agree with that? Or?
Yep. I alluded earlier to the importance of digitization and the interconnected cities, smart cities. When you take a look at the potential there is with these technologies, it's simply stunning. We don't even understand at this point where the technology is going, and the acceleration, the pace of these technologies is really remarkable. Look at driverless cars as a potential. When you take a look at the impact of that in terms of urban congestion downtown, in terms of the amount of space that's used for parking lots at the present time, if indeed we could use our automobiles far more effectively and efficiently than we do today. Ontario is trying to facilitate experimentation with driverless automobiles. General Motors in its facility in Oshawa is focusing on new technologies, the brains that you can put into cars to make them far more effective and safer as a result as well. To me, the most interesting part of the question, though, was where the questioner asked about how do we ensure that we don't lock ourselves into technologies that are going to become obsolete. And I think the answer is by not locking ourselves in. It's a matter of mindset as much as anything else. My concern is where government attempts to bless a technology and to freeze it in time and to say, this is the one that will be permitted and others will be prevented. What if I can be very controversial here, what if we took the model of Uber, which is about as disruptive a technology as I can think of, and instead of conspiring to block disruptive technologies that reinvent the way in which we do transportation, what if we embraced them and said what we want to do is to encourage these new technologies that force us to rethink how we live and how we do business? Then we would be able to see breakthroughs that none of us can imagine today. Let me touch briefly, because it's highly related, on the issue of rural areas. I was also Minister of National Health and Welfare and had a number of other portfolios in government. And of course, as you look at the remote areas in Canada, 90% of Canada's population is like weather stripping along the US border. And there are vast areas with small settlements of people. These new technologies are democratizing in their nature. Telehealth allows you to go out and to plug people in the most rural areas into the most modern medicine. Distance education is another area. There are a whole range of other ways in which these technologies can help to equalize some of the differences we see today between rural areas and people living in the large urban metropolises.
Thank you very much. Jaime.
Yeah. I tend to agree that technology is going to change the way people in rural areas access information and also get treated on health. I think that is all very valid. However, I think a reality we must all face, and this is going back to the question of the young lady, is urbanization is here to stay. It's where employment will be. It's where the higher paying jobs generally will be. It's where the educational creative hubs will be. I think we have to just make a conscious decision and overweight everything cities need, because that influx, I believe, will not stop. It will be a trend that continues as far as I can see. And while I completely agree that there will be a lot of linkages that will allow people in outer areas to subscribe to many of the elements that make modern living a positive thing, I think the influx of people to major urban centers is not going to decrease, which is where I would argue the overweighting of ideas, emphasis, capital, coordination on solutions to the livability of urban centers has to continue unabated, irrespective of where technology takes us in linking up people outside cities.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, I would like you to reflect on something and give a quick response. If you had to draw up an agenda for the cities of the future, what would be the 2 or 3 items on that agenda? And because we are close to the time when we need to close this session, I ask you to keep your agenda to no more than 1.5 minutes each. Why don't we start with Dr. Apple, and then we will have Perrin, Jaime, and then the last word to the Lord Mayor, Robert Doyle.
Yeah, so I would focus on 3 things. First, focusing on how you can maximize the capacity of the existing infrastructure. That's very short-term oriented and can relieve already stress from cities. Second is long-term planning, which is 20 years plus somehow. And the third is, I think there's an immediate action as well, which is getting more incentivization of electric vehicles somehow, because that would help significantly the livability of cities somehow, I believe.
Thank you very much. We are beginning to have an outline for the next session at next year's CEO Summit on Cities. Perrin.
Technology, I'll come back to that. We need to focus on that now and start making decisions now that enable us to become far more interconnected and to use these technologies effectively. Infrastructure, physical infrastructure, particularly focused on how we attack the serious problems of urban transportation and the ability as well of business to be able to move the goods that it needs. But the third is human. And particularly now with the refugee crisis that we are watching and with the events in Paris last Friday, it really brings home to us the fact that it's how we live with each other that's absolutely critical. In Toronto today, half the people living in Toronto were born outside of Canada. And it's a human experiment that's underway to bring people of all different backgrounds together and to ensure that they can live together in harmony and that they can draw the best from each other. That is, I think, in many ways, the greatest challenge that we face in coming years. It's how we ensure that in our urban areas and our societies that we're able to find formulae that will allow us to work in harmony with one another.
Thank you very much. Jaime.
Maybe just to add one final thought on a topic we haven't discussed, which is health and sanitation. I'm reaching a conclusion and the thesis I have is that urbanization is here to stay. You'll get it. There'll be denser and denser, populations keep increasing, and the danger of health and sanitation becoming a major issue or perhaps a massive problem is always there. That revolves around waste, about the way water is handled, and the health needs, I guess, of a population that's increasingly dense. I think that's an area that perhaps should be overweighted as we move on, and the kind of infrastructure that supports the health of individuals be given a bigger weight than normal, of course, notwithstanding all the other issues that need to be tackled.
Thank you very much. Robert?
I want to be really expert in the future at dealing and coping with disruption. We've spoken about the disruption that natural disasters may cause, and we're going to have to deal with those, whether they're weather events or man-made, as Perrin has just suggested. In dealing with the disruption of infrastructure, you know, when we build that 18-kilometre underground rail tunnel straight under the middle of the city, it is going to alter the way the city operates for 6 years. And we're going to need to deal with that as we do that. Or it might be disruption of technologies like Uber, as Perrin just said. Or it might be the fact that in my central street, the central spine of our city, we took all the private cars out of it. All of them. So there's only trams, the busiest tram route in the world, pedestrians and cyclists. Disruptive. But no great city in the world is trying to bring more cars into its centre. And so you've got to do something about that if you want a livable city. And finally, a subset of what Perrin said then, I think about disruption in employment. You know, unless people have a job, unless you have an economy, unless you are prosperous, you can't do any of the other stuff. It's the coping stone, it's the first building block. In Australia at the moment, the car manufacturing industry is exiting Australia, GM, Ford and Toyota, because we're simply not competitive on labour costs with countries like the Philippines. And so how do we cope with that disruption? How do we generate the new employment in the knowledge sectors that will keep us a prosperous city? You know, how do we educate young people for jobs that don't yet exist? How do we give them lifelong learning skills so that they are a part of that new economy and can contribute to resilience, to sustainability, to taking care of each other and that livability? So I think that ability to cope with and absorb disruption in whatever form it takes and turn it to your advantage is what's going to be crucial in the future of cities, because they're just not going to be like they are right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a rich, wide-ranging discussion on the future of cities and the cities of the future. And it is clear from this discussion that this is not just a discussion about urbanization. This is a discussion on how we will live and work in the future, because more and more of us will be living in cities. And it's also clear from this discussion that it's not just about the usual things about cities. It's about technology, it is about governance, it is about how we are to live with each other, it is about partnerships, it is about investment, it is about financing, some of which we were not able to touch in this discussion. This is an important discussion. It is the beginning of a conversation, and we need all to take part in this conversation. For now, please join me in thanking our excellent panel, Jaime Zobel,